In January 1944, the Allied forces in Italy came under fire from enormously powerful German super-heavy artillery. The massive, high-explosive shells were fired from two huge railway guns located almost 30 miles away. The Allied troops on the receiving end of these guns christened the two monstrous weapons Anzio Annie and the Anzio Express. The two German guns were type K5E railguns that had originally been sent to Italy for shipment to the Afrika Korps in Tunisia. The Tunisian campaign had ended before they could be shipped, so the two monstrous guns were pressed instead into service in Italy. The K5 railgun was considered one of the finest railguns ever produced. In Italy, they were to prove the point.
This is a German K5 railroad gun. It's called Leopold. During the Anzio campaign, it was also known as Anzio Annie. It'll fire a 520-pound projectile 31 miles with very great accuracy. This particular gun had a sister gun named Dorothy. During the French campaign, at the end of the French campaign, the two guns were taken down to the coast near Calais, and they shelled Great Britain from France.
The first K5 gun had entered service in 1936 and remained in production until 1945. The final number produced is now uncertain, but it is believed that between 25 and 28 were made. In almost every way, the K5 was a sound, thorough design, with excellent ammunition handling equipment and a long, slender barrel that provided the gun with its German nickname, Schlanke Bertha, or Slim Bertha. Every hour, the K5E could hurl 8 11-inch shells weighing approximately 250 pounds, just over 38 miles. But this enormous firepower required a huge logistical tail with its own complete railway train. Besides the specially designed rail carriage for Slim Bertha itself, the train included an ammunition wagon, a railway car for the crew, a railway car for equipment, various support cars, and of course, a locomotive to pull the enormous load. As the war progressed and the Luftwaffe lost control of the skies, flak wagons were added to the train to provide anti-aircraft cover for this most tempting target. The blasts from the gun would rattle windows a mile away. After the round left the barrel, a forward artillery spotter located up to 35 miles away, nearer to the target, would observe the fall of the shot and would radio any corrections to the gunnery officer. New settings would be calculated, and the whole elaborate procedure would start again.
It was a very difficult and complex exercise to bring a gun like a railway gun into operation for a tactical situation such as existed around the Anzio beachheads. These guns were really designed to be deployed in sieges, and in this instance it was a kind of siege, but really they were deployed in a role of providing harassing fire. So what it meant was obviously the gunners with the gun couldn't see, because they were so far away, how the shells were actually landing. The guns were between 25 and 35 miles away from the site where the shells would actually land. So what they needed was an observer close to the beachhead who would observe where the shells landed and then radio the guns, who would then make any necessary adjustments in how the guns were aimed in order to try and achieve greater accuracy.
The two guns, which became known as Anzio Annie and the Anzio Express, were sent south to the Anzio area via Rome at the end of January 1944. Finding a location for the guns and their trains was the first priority. This position selected was not far from Albano, on the main Rome to Nettuno railway line, at points where the track entered tunnels. The advantage of the K5E was that it could be kept under cover in the tunnel, being pushed out to fire and immediately pulled back in again once the huge round had been fired. The fire from the guns was so regular that the Allied troops immediately assumed they faced only a single weapon, despite the fact that two guns were actually involved. For 4 months, the two guns made the lives of the Allied soldiers in the Anzio beachhead extremely uncomfortable. A constant traffic of devastatingly high explosive shells was fired into the claustrophobic confines of the beachhead. In conjunction with the two big guns, a constant bombardment from lighter artillery units added to the misery.
There was a lot of very effective, constant artillery fire coming down on the beachhead at Anzio. It made the beach a hellish place to work, and it was very effective at making the lives of the Allied soldiers holding the beachhead truly miserable. However, most of the artillery fire that came down on the Anzio beachhead was coming from less spectacular German heavy artillery. It was not so much Anzio Annie and Anzio Express or the slightly smaller 21-centimeter railguns that were causing the ongoing daily hell of British and American servicemen on the beach at Anzio. It was the more mundane 170-millimeter German heavy artillery that was grouped around the beachhead and that could fire many more rounds quite rapidly at the Allies.
The Allied Air Force did what they could to find and destroy the K5 firing sites, although it was the RAF who managed to accurately identify the firing positions. The firing area was well camouflaged, and the guns were always kept inside the tunnel when Allied aircraft approached. The gun wrought terrible damage and remained in action until the Allies broke through the Gustav Line. But with the fall of Cassino to Allied forces in March 1944, the Gustav Line was effectively broken, and the Allies stormed north to relieve the Anzio beachhead. They did this by rapidly moving north, not along the coastal route, but inland, which cut off the railway lines that would have provided the big guns with their escape route. The guns were captured almost intact and ready to move out. One gun was damaged by its crew before capture, but the other was found almost complete, and this example was later shipped to the United States for examination and test firing. It still sits at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, USA. At divisional level, the Standard Wehrmacht Division of World War II deployed more and heavier artillery pieces than their opponents.
On paper, in theory, a fully equipped German infantry division had a regiment of artillery at its disposal. It was quite a large regiment of artillery, as German divisional artillery regiments went. It had 4 Abteilungen, 4 subdivisions of guns, and it had, at full strength, at the beginning of the war, 48 guns to support the division. Later in the war, the establishment was changed, and there were fewer guns. It went down to about 42 guns for a full-strength German division. But the key point to keep in mind was that throughout the Second World War, there was a tremendous problem keeping the divisional artillery up to full strength. And very often, German divisional artillery regiments did not have as many guns as they were supposed to have.
The first weapon to be issued to the German army after World War I was the 7.5 centimeter LELG-18. It was a light, sturdy piece of equipment that used an unusual form of construction. The barrel was carried in a rectangular casing, which was hinged into another, which carried the fixed breech block and firing mechanism. The whole process was similar to that of a shotgun breech, and though unusual, it was fast and simple. The carriage was a simple box trailer with a shield. The wheels were either wooden spoked and iron-rimmed for horse-drawn models, or steel disc with pneumatic tires if it were designed to be drawn by truck. These first guns were used extensively throughout the war, but their use tended to decline towards the end of the war when increasingly heavier weapons were needed. One solution was the 10.5 centimeter howitzer, which were in use in large numbers during the early war years. Initially, they gave the German divisional artillery the edge over nearly all their opponents, most of whom used obsolete World War I equipment with a maximum 7.5 centimeter caliber.
The German infantry division gained the backbone of its artillery support from the 105mm FH-18 field howitzer. This was often a horse-drawn equipment, although in certain units it was transported by a German artillery half-track. In most units it was in fact horse-drawn. A German infantry division could rely on 3 batteries of these 105 field howitzers, supported by another battery of heavier guns, 150mm field howitzers, and also 100mm guns. So a fair degree of fire support, but very conventional, in fact, in its general make-up and organisation.
But as the war went on, more modern opponents in the shape of the British 25 PR or 8.5 centimeter weapon and the deceptively powerful Soviet 7.6 centimeter guns, which showed that the 10.5 centimeter howitzers could be outranged without undue difficulty, even by smaller caliber weapons. The events of the Russian winter campaign of 1941 to 42 exposed the other major shortcoming of the German guns. The alternate cycle of frost and thaw during that winter reduced the rough roads that supplied the Eastern Front into quagmires. In going like this, the heavy German howitzers could make only slow progress. Many were lost during that winter of 1941 to 42, simply because they got stuck fast in frozen mud during the retreat and could not be moved.
An infantry division's artillery in the German army at the beginning of the Second World War was generally horse-drawn. And it moved at about the same walking pace as a foot-borne infantry soldier. So the artillery of a division was no more mobile than the soldiers in the division. And it was drawn slowly by horses. It relied on horse fodder and horse water for transport rather than for petrol. And outside of certain particular applications, such as mountain divisions, the infantry division artillery was quite slow at the beginning of the war. Later on in the war, it became necessary to motorize the artillery of a division. And infantry division artillery started to be towed by petrol-powered tractors.
In the panzer divisions, the guns were generally drawn by half-tracks, large artillery half-tracks, and on occasion, if a panzer division was lucky, it might get an allocation of either Hummels or Wesps, which were self-propelled artillery. But in the main, for the standard German infantry division, it was horse-drawn artillery throughout the war.
Where the problems really came were in not so much in Western Europe, where there were good roads. So for the fall of Poland and France, there wasn't much to encounter, and those were all fought in the summer or the early summer. Where the real problems came, of course, was in Russia. There were no good roads, and there were these tremendous seasons of mud and snow and ice and all of the conditions that make moving heavy artillery probably one of the worst things you can imagine. The guns would sink up to their axles or past their axles in mud. They would need an enormous amount of horse and manpower to draw them out of there. Sometimes it just wasn't practical, in which case they would stay stuck in the mud until the mud froze, at which point it froze rock solid, and again they couldn't move it. So the mobility issue was a huge one for the German army in Russia. The front line would move up to 1,500 miles away from Berlin and then move all the way back. So there were big distances that people were covering. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, for example, the German army in Russia had 625,000 horses on the staff in order to pull the gun. So it was by no means the kind of armoured juggernaut of legend, and that certainly slowed down the infantry divisions.
Despite the initial success, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 revealed many of the limitations of the German medium artillery arm. The previous 2 years of war had seemed to indicate that their artillery weapons were adequate. As the winter of 1941 turned into the thaw of 1942, it was painfully obvious that the German artillery pieces were cumbersome and lacked range as opposed to their Soviet equivalents. New designs were in the works, but the gunners in the front line had to do something to counter their opponents, and the easiest solution was to simply use as much captured Soviet material as possible. During the Great Attack in 1941, so many Soviet guns and howitzers were captured that the Germans were able to transport large numbers across Europe to bolster the Atlantic wall defenses and to equip the artillery formations in France and Italy. Russian artillery even saw service with the Afrika Korps in the desert. These German gunners are using captured Russian 76mm guns. Compared with the relatively few types of equipment taken into the field by many of the Allied armies, the size and scope of German medium and heavy artillery formations were too diverse and varied to be supplied easily. The presence of large numbers of captured guns didn't help. Although the logistical situation deteriorated over the course of the war, the training and skill of the German gun teams meant that the German artillery remained a formidable opponent throughout the war, despite the confusion which was caused by the large variety of guns in service. The heaviest weapon issued to the German infantry division as an infantry gun was the 15-centimeter Schwerinfanteriegeschütz 33, a heavy infantry support gun, known to the troops by its initials as a SIG-33. The SIG-33 was a reliable and robust piece that could hurl a 150mm high-explosive charge over a range of about 5 kilometers. Its standard ammunition was usually a high-explosive shell, but it could also fire a screening smoke shell if the tactical situation required a smoke screen. An anti-tank hollow-shaped charge was also issued in 1941, but the SIG-33 was far too cumbersome to be used in an anti-tank role. One other drawback was the lack of velocity in the shells fired. Perhaps the most remarkable projectile fired by the SIG-33 was the 15-centimeter Stylgranat 42. A 200-pound stick bomb, it was used for short-range demolition work against enemy strongpoints. This had a high-explosive warhead mounted on a driving rod and carried 3 fins on offset arms. It was muzzle-loaded, the rod entered into the barrel and the fins lying alongside the muzzle. A special blank cartridge was used to launch the bomb, much in the same manner as an oversized rifle grenade. About 150 yards from the muzzle, the driving rod fell away and left the finned warhead to continue its flight to the target. This was able to deliver 60 pounds of explosive up to 1 kilometer away. In 1934, production began on the SFH-18, a 15-centimeter howitzer that was built by Rheinmetall GmbH and mounted on a carriage built by the famous weapons manufacturer, Krupp. This was to become the backbone of the Wehrmacht's medium artillery. No records exist of the actual numbers produced, but it would have been substantial, since the SFH-18 remained in service throughout the entire war, and many were delivered to Finland and Italy for their use. Despite using 8 different charges, the maximum range of the SFH-18 was only 13,325 meters, and early combat experience revealed that the opposition, especially after 1941, often outranged it when German artillery encountered the formidable Soviet 152mm guns and howitzers. Although contracts were awarded to develop new designs and a 17cm version was introduced later in the war, the pace of events was such that the SFH-18 was never replaced. Airborne units, mountain troops, and special army formations were a special problem for German weapon designers. These units needed artillery, but did not have the means to transport the heavy pieces. They needed a range of efficient, lightweight artillery, which could be carried on pack animals or quickly rushed in by air where necessary. Decreasing the weight of a conventional artillery piece is usually achieved by the use of light alloys in the barrel and carriage construction. But these were in short supply in Germany throughout the war. In a conventional gun, the energy released when a propellant charge is exploded not only drives the projectile from the barrel, but also forces the barrel to the rear, where it is slowed by the carriage recoil mechanism. As the forces involved in firing a gun are considerable, the recoil mechanism has to be sturdy and therefore very heavy. The recoilless gun was the solution to the problem. The exhaust gases were allowed to escape through a nozzle placed to the rear of a breech, providing the equal or appropriate force to the blast, which stopped the gun from recoiling. The first service version of a recoilless gun was the Krupp LG-11, which entered limited service with the Luftwaffe paratroops during 1940. They were first used in action during the airborne assault on Crete. As a first attempt, the LG-1.300 had its shortcomings, one of which was that the carriage weight had been reduced to the point where it proved to be too flimsy for the rigorous demands of active service. The replacement design, the 7.5cm LG-40, was a much more robust weapon, with a revised breech and small all-metal wheels. The LG-40 embodied most of the features of the later German recoilless guns. In 1943, it was decided that a larger gun was required, and the 10.5cm was put into service. In the airborne role, the 7.5 and 10.5cm guns could be landed in several ways. One was to drop them in several separate loads in containers suspended from parachutes. Practiced crews could then assemble the guns and bring them into action in about 2 minutes. Another method was to suspend the guns in tubular steel frames under transport aircraft, which could then land with them or drop them using large parachutes. A further alternative was to load the gun together with its light tractor in a Gotha GO242 glider. If an aircraft was available, considerable loads could be flown in by the 6-engined Messerschmitt Gigant, although as we can see from this sequence shot in Russia during 1943, despite the huge size of the aircraft, loading was never easy. Numbers of recoilless guns were also issued to mountain troops, but very often their dangerous exhaust characteristics restricted their use. So specialized conventional guns were developed.
In mountainous terrain, there were a number of factors which influenced the type of guns you could use. The troops would always be in need of artillery support, and it posed some very special problems. In order, obviously, to be able to get a gun up a mountain, you couldn't take vehicles up there, so the guns had to be capable of being broken down into small loads, which could then be carried by mules. And they were actually officially described as being a 4-mule load or an 8-mule load or however many were necessary. One of the other things you didn't want in mountain warfare was a gun which recoiled, because if it recoiled backwards too far, who's to say it wasn't going to keep going in over the side of a cliff or something like that.
In one form or another, the rocket has been a weapon of war for many centuries. Among the larger rockets used by the Germans were 15, 28, and 32 centimetre missiles. The 15 centimetre rocket was the most common and was intended for service in batteries. Its tactical role was the saturation of large target areas with high explosives, smoke, or poison gas. It was designated the 15 centimetre Wurfgranate 41 and was first issued during late 1940. The spin-stabilized 15 centimetre WGR 41 was produced with a range of fillings. As the rocket motors were affected by extremes in temperature, special versions were issued to cope with the tropical encounters of the Africa Corps. Yet another special variant had to be produced to deal with the opposite extremes of cold encountered on the Russian front. The main projector used to launch the missiles in Russia was the 15 centimetre WGR 41. But fired by the specially formed Nebeltruppen or fog troops was the 15 centimetre Nebelwerfer 41.
Nebelwerfer means essentially smoke thrower, and it had been designed as a weapon which could lay down a very thick smoke screen very quickly. In fact, the Germans realised that this 6-barrelled rocket launcher could deliver a very heavy bombardment of high explosive projectiles as well as a very heavy smoke bombardment. And thus the Nebelwerfer, when it first came into use in 1942, was used as an artillery piece that could lay down its 6 rocket projectiles over a very concentrated area. The British described the Nebelwerfer as the moaning Mini and grew to hate a Nebelwerfer stonk, as they called it, as it could be very devastating.
The Nebelwerfer was produced in all different versions. There was a single-barreled version for paratroops. There was a 10-barreled version that went about in an armoured tracked carrier. And there was a giant 30-centimetre Nebelwerfer that fired a rocket. There was a 10-barreled 150-millimetre Nebelwerfer. Lots of these were designed to fire an artillery projectile without the encumbrance of having a gun. The Nebelwerfer was much smaller and fired much more rapidly than a gun because it was so simple. It wasn't always very accurate, could never be as accurate as an artillery piece, but it was very simple and easy to operate. There were, in fact, Nebelwerfers that were designed to take the rounds and fire them directly from their packing cases without even having to take them out of the box and set them up. Not an accurate way to fire a rocket, but very rapid and very convenient.
It was never designed to be a weapon that you could fire onto a pinpoint target. But the morale effect of the noise and the sheer ferocity of the bombardment, which landed with terrific force over a short period in a given area, was absolutely terrifying, and frequently troops would break under the strain. Even though they hadn't been injured, they would run away from sheer terror.
The Nebelwerfer, or fog thrower, had 6 launcher tubes mounted on a carriage. After the rockets were loaded and connected to an electrical charge for firing, the crew took cover some distance away, and the rockets were fired, one at a time, in a timed ripple. The effects of a Nebelwerfer barrage were devastating. The concussion from such a huge number of shells would suck the air out of a man's lungs, and although they were not particularly accurate, the terrifying shriek of the missiles and the ferocity of the bombardment was often enough to cause the dazed survivors of a barrage to surrender, even if they were not physically injured. There were dangers to the crew. The Nebelwerfer soon became a hated adversary, and if the dust did not reveal the launcher's position, then the smoke trail left by the rockets certainly would. The Nebelwerfer batteries were first choice targets for counter-battery fire, and crews had to be very skilled at getting in and out of firing positions quickly. As the war progressed, heavier rockets were also used by the Nebeltruppen. Both 28 and 32-centimeter rockets were fired from a more substantial two-wheeled trailer that held the rockets in two superimposed rows of three. Although the fire for the heavy Nebelwerfers was very effective, those trailers were discovered to be too cumbersome to keep up with fast-moving panzer troops, so a solution was found. Simple frames, designed to carry and launch the rockets, were attached three to the side of the 251 half-tracks. This configuration became very successful and earned the name Stuka zu Fuß, ground Stuka. Later in the war, more sophisticated firing platforms were added for heavier rockets. All of the German rockets were spin-stabilized in flight. By contrast, the Allied forces used fin-stabilized weapons. When the invasion of the Soviet Union brought the Wehrmacht in contact with the dreaded Soviet Katyusha rocket batteries, doubts were raised about the value of spin versus fin stabilization. Since production was in full steam, the designs were not changed.
The Nebelwerfer wasn't a particularly sophisticated piece of equipment. How it operated was that what little accuracy there was came from imparting spin to the rockets. So as they left the barrels, the rockets spun, and that kept them on course. It required some reasonably sophisticated technology. When the Russians saw how effective the Nebelwerfer was in action, they immediately began to produce their own answer, and that became the famous Stalin organ, or the Katyuska. The Katyuska employed fins on the rockets. It meant that the launching mechanism could be very simple because they didn't have to impart any spin onto the projectiles. It could be literally almost an orange box, a crate, that these finned rockets were fired from. They were stuck onto the back of trucks and taken to the front line. The Nebelwerfer, on the other hand, was increasingly experimented with. They found that by mounting rockets on half-tracks, they had not only a very powerful weapon, but a very mobile weapon. Needless to say, there were other calls for the half-tracks, and they never really got them into the numbers that they really needed. Having said that, once they were mounted on half-tracks, you had a very, very sophisticated weapon which brought a tremendous amount of force to bear, and it also gave mobility, which was something that was essential for a war like the Russian front.
Post-war trials demonstrated that the Nebelwerfer was more accurate than the feared Stalin organ Katyusha rocket. It was only the fact that the Soviets were able to throw more ordnance downrange at a cheaper cost, which gave the receiving Germans that impression. In May of 1942, spurred on by victories at Kerch and Kharkov on the Russian front, Hitler decided to take Sevastopol. The port was one of the world's strongest fortresses and was protected by 12 naval gun batteries comprising 42 guns, varying in caliber from 152 millimeters to 305 millimeters. There were 106,000 Soviet troops and more than 80,000 naval personnel manning the forts and gun emplacements. Hitler felt that this was the perfect opportunity to showcase his super heavy artillery, designed to be used against the now defeated Maginot Line. The Germans brought up 33 pieces of siege artillery, ranging in caliber from 280 millimeters to 800 millimeters.
Sevastopol, and its capture by the Germans in 1942, was in many respects a unique operation in the Second World War. Sevastopol, the great port for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, was incredibly heavily defended by concrete casemates and very large artillery pieces. In this way, the operations to capture Sevastopol did resemble a kind of classic siege in which artillery pieces played a very important part. General Manstein, the German commander of the operation, assembled over 200 batteries of artillery, including over 450 pieces of super heavy artillery. These guns were vital in puncturing the very heavy defences of Sevastopol and raining 1 and sometimes 2 ton shells down on the Russian defenders. Clearly, in this operation, and as I've said, very unusual, super heavy artillery pieces were vital for the success of the operation.
General von Manstein, who was in charge of the siege of Sevastopol, was a very able commander. He proved to be one of the best in the whole Second World War. And he decided that there would be this terrific bombardment, which endured probably for a period of a month, during which time the very heaviest guns in the whole siege train would be used very skillfully to reduce all of the concrete defences. I mean, there are instances where some defences that were as much as 30 metres underground were pulverised by the deployment of these huge artillery pieces, which were used as they should be. They were used en masse, they were used against a single target, and they were used in a concentrated way under the direction of von Manstein, who really knew what he was doing.
On June the 3rd, 1942, General von Manstein started to rain shells on the Soviet defenders and citizens of Sevastopol. Over 750 pieces of artillery took part in the bombardment. 4 weeks later, what had been Sevastopol now looked like the surface of the moon. Finally, as a result of continuous shelling lasting 1 month, Sevastopol fell on July the 3rd. Two notable weapon designs, the 42-centimetre mortar Gamma and the 60-centimetre mortar Karl, both took part in the barrage. These were super-heavy self-propelled mortars, capable of discharging highly efficient shells over a high trajectory, which were powerful enough to penetrate thick concrete. The Karl mortar was the largest of all the self-propelled guns to see action in World War II.
The Karl series of siege mortars can almost be seen as a throwback to an earlier age. The First World War had seen the development of railguns and super-heavy mortars to a great degree, and given the static nature of the fighting on the Western Front, these weapons were very valuable. However, when the Karl series of mortars were first posited in 1935, the idea of a 60-centimetre mortar firing a shell weighing 1.5 tons, perhaps 11,000 yards, while that performance sounds impressive, given the fact that the German army was actually preparing to fight a series of mobile actions based on speed and manoeuvre rather than siege weapons, in some ways the weapons do seem to be a throwback. In actual use, the two guns, Thor and Eva, first completed in 1939, were transported to the Russian front and used in the bombardment of the fortress of Brest-Litovsk during July 1941, and then later used in the siege of Sevastopol in 1941 and into 1942.
The Karl series of siege mortars were very, very effective under the right circumstances. They were designed for siege warfare, and they were designed to be brought up very close to the defences, where they could fire these enormous heavyweight shells which were so destructive they could take out concrete bunkers and very well emplaced concrete defences. The problem with a weapon like that is you must have complete air superiority, you must have the ability to move it up to the defences and know that it's not going to be vulnerable to counter-attack. In a siege like Sevastopol, all of those circumstances prevailed.
Although the Karl series' top speed on roads or firm terrain was claimed to be 10 kilometers an hour, they were simply too large and cumbersome to be considered as self-propellant. The largest of all the artillery pieces was equally cumbersome. The 80-centimeter railgun Schwer Gustav, 80-centimeter KE, known as Dora, was sighted 16 kilometers away from Sevastopol on specially laid tracks. It took 2 weeks to emplace, so it wasn't until the third day of the barrage that its 1,300-man crew fired their first round. By the time they had finished, 48 shells had been fired at a variety of targets, all of which were completely demolished. Perhaps the most spectacular success was the destruction of an underground ammunition magazine 30 meters under Severnaya Bay. 8 shots were fired at this target, which was completely destroyed, and a small sailing ship was sunk in the process.
This is an 800-millimeter projectile. It went to a gun called Schwer Gustav. The problem with that gun is that it took 5,000 men to erect the gun. It took 6 weeks to do it. It had a firing crew of 500. It had a major general for a gun captain. So in my own little way, I like to think that that gun helped the Allies win World War II.
By employing massive amounts of super-heavy siege artillery in a concentrated area, the forces of the Wehrmacht were literally able to dismantle the city of Sevastopol block by block. The slow-moving siege artillery was extremely vulnerable to attack from the air, so it was imperative that the Germans controlled the skies. With this control, the Wehrmacht was able to take its time and set up the siege guns with careful consideration to their targeting. Without harassment from the defenders, the siege guns and conventional artillery emplaced around Sevastopol were able to fire over 1,000 tons of ordnance onto the town. After Sevastopol, as the Allies took back control of the skies and supplies became scarce, these weapons became more of a hindrance than a help. Of the various German schemes for superweapons, none seems as wasteful as the super guns, being costly in raw materials, manpower, and supplies. As static pieces of siege equipment, there was no questioning the effect of mortars and railguns, but even the 80-centimeter KE creators, Krupp, admitted, while it was a valuable research tool, as a practical weapon of war it was useless with the advent of the aeroplane. Blitzkrieg rendered the super-heavy guns obsolete. In sharp contrast to Sevastopol was the 900-day siege of Leningrad. The mighty Wehrmacht artillery was able to crush the fortress port of Sevastopol, but Leningrad held out for nearly 3 years. Perhaps the main reason was that Sevastopol was given priority over Leningrad in order to prevent the German army's southern flank from being exposed, as Army Group South made its push to the oil-rich Caucasus. The Wehrmacht's siege train of super-heavy artillery was directed south against Sevastopol and Leningrad, and was therefore spared from the heaviest of the guns. South of the city of Leningrad, Observatory Hill near the city of Pushkin was captured in September 1941, and the tower situated at the top provided German artillery spotters with an unimpeded view of the entire city of Leningrad. The city was placed within range of the Wehrmacht's artillery batteries, and by November, a continuous artillery barrage had begun. In just 2 months, between September and November 1941, a total of 272 German artillery bombardments slammed into the city over a total of 430 hours. Conventional German artillery lacked the concrete smashing ability of the super-heavies being brought to bear on Sevastopol, and many of the well-constructed buildings of Leningrad stood up to the blasts. Although Hitler's forces could probably have taken Leningrad by storm in 1941, Hitler was reluctant to give the order. While the relentless German artillery took many lives in Leningrad, starvation was, in fact, the biggest killer. Leningrad was shaken to its very foundations, and resistance nearly collapsed. But in the end, the German guns were simply not large enough to crush the city into submission.
No single weapon can win a battle. You can fire a lot of artillery rounds at a town, at a city, in the case of Leningrad. You can kill a lot of people, maim thousands, make everybody miserable. But without actually facing the formidable defenses of the city, without attacking it with infantry, taking the losses and the risks that's attached to that, you can't expect the city to just put its hands up and surrender.
Really, the German army in Russia had the ability to either reduce Leningrad or reduce Sevastopol. They didn't have the resources to do both in 1942, with the result that the decision was to concentrate on the operations of Army Group South.
Fresh from the success at Sevastopol in August of 1942, General von Manstein, along with 5 divisions and the Sevastopol siege train, were ordered north to Leningrad. But the offensive was cancelled at the end of September. Hitler was now concerned about the approaching Russian winter, and the siege guns were never adequately massed and brought to bear against Leningrad. By October, Soviet reinforcements were able to enter in the battle sufficient numbers and begin the task of pushing the German artillery back. It would take until January 1944, but eventually, Leningrad would be saved.
Stay with us next tonight as the German army settled in for a long, hard winter in the battle for Russia. It's Battlefield after the break.